Hello guys, this is Real Recaps. In this video, I will talk about a 1974 Canadian slasher film, Black Christmas. Before we start, I hope you will like and subscribe to the channel. At the start of the film, a man is seen lurking around a sorority house. He climbs up a trellis to the second floor. Inside, people are gathered for a party. Phyllis is with her boyfriend when Barb receives a strange phone call. From upstairs, the man can be seen watching Barb. Claire says goodbye to her boyfriend, Chris, and they talk about skiing plans. Then the phone rings, and Jess answers. She gathers everyone and reveals that it's the man who has been moaning again. The group listens in as the man makes disturbing noises, snorts like a pig, and makes crude comments. Barb grabs the phone and curses at him. He threatens to kill her before hanging up. Claire warns Barb not to provoke the man, mentioning that a girl was assaulted recently. Barb mocks Claire's concern, so Claire walks off to her room. Jess defends Claire, pointing out that she's already had trouble fitting in. Mrs. Mack enters, carrying gifts. Meanwhile, upstairs, Claire hugs Mrs. Mack's cat and begins packing. The mysterious man is hiding in her closet. Claire hears something and assumes it's the cat, Claude. But when she gets closer to the closet, the man grabs her with plastic bags and drags her to the attic. After the party, Mrs. Mack drinks from a hidden stash of alcohol before Jess returns. The phone rings again, and this time Phyllis answers. It's Peter, Jess's boyfriend. Jess mentions she has something important to share with him face to face. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mack brushes her teeth but continues struggling with her alcohol addiction, retrieving alcohol hidden in the toilet tank and using it as mouthwash. Jess visits Claire's door and knocks but gets no response. In the attic, Claire's lifeless body is revealed sitting in a rocking chair. The following day, Claire's father arrives, searching for his daughter. Mrs. Mack welcomes Mr. Harrison and explains she has no idea where Claire is, assuming she had left for vacation since her clothes were packed. Mrs. Mack suggests Claire might be at the fraternity house with the other girls. Afterward, Mrs. Mack prepares to leave and indulges in more drinking. Mr. Harrison and Mrs. Mack leave the sorority house together. Jess informs Peter that she is pregnant but intends to have an abortion. Peter insists he wants to keep the baby. Upset, Peter tells Jess to leave, but before she does, he asks to meet her later that night to talk further. Meanwhile, Mr. Harrison is at the fraternity house, increasingly worried when he finds out Claire isn't there. Jess then answers another phone call, where the creepy man makes more disturbing noises. At the police station, Phyllis, Barb, and Mr. Harrison try to report Claire missing. Officer Nash asks Barb for the sorority house's phone number, which she humorously provides as fellatio. Mrs. Mack, still drinking, returns to the house and goes upstairs to find more alcohol. Jess visits Claire's boyfriend, Chris, during his hockey practice, but he has no idea where Claire is either. Meanwhile, Peter plays a frantic piano piece during an audition. At the police station, a woman reports her 13-year-old daughter, Janice, missing, but Lieutenant Kenneth Fuller dismisses her concerns. However, when Chris urgently asks for help, Fuller agrees to assist him. At the sorority house, Mrs. Mack, Barb, Mr. Harrison, and Phyllis are cleaning up after dinner. Barb tells Mr. Harrison about a type of turtle that can mate for days, which disturbs him. Barb, feeling guilty for her behavior toward Claire, goes on a drunk rampage and heads upstairs to rest. Meanwhile, Peter angrily destroys a grand piano after a failed audition and his frustration over Jess and the pregnancy. Jess and Chris arrive at the sorority house and join Phyllis and Mr. Harrison to search for Claire. Before leaving, Mrs. Mack informs them she plans to visit her sister for the holidays, so she might not be there when they return. Meanwhile, Mrs. Quaife, whose 13-year-old daughter, Janice, is missing, appears deeply worried as the police organize a search party for her child. Mrs. Mack starts packing for her trip, sipping more alcohol as a taxi waits outside, honking to signal its arrival. While gathering her belongings, She hears what she believes is her cat, Claude, and goes to find him. Following the sound, she is led to the attic. Climbing the ladder, she calls out for Claude, but above her, someone lurks, holding a hook. Mrs. Mack then notices Cla's lifeless body seated in a rocking chair. Before she can react, the figure swings the hook, striking Mrs. Mack and pulling her into the attic. Outside, the taxi driver looks for Mrs. Mack, but she never comes out. Meanwhile, the killer, frustrated, tosses items around in the attic. Back at the search party, Jess, feeling cold, leaves. A woman screams upon finding something, and everyone rushes over to discover the body of Janice, the missing 13-year-old girl. Back at the sorority house, Jess answers the phone again. It's more creepy noises, sounding like two people, along with screaming. She hangs up and calls for Mrs. Mack, but there's no answer. Jess dials the police and, as she does, notices a shadow moving down the stairs. She's startled but realizes it's only Peter, who claims he's been upstairs sleeping. Jess reports the prank calls to Officer Nash, but he dismisses them, saying they're too busy with more urgent matters. Peter tells Jess he's quitting the conservatory and wants to marry her, insisting on keeping the baby. Jess rejects his proposal, explaining that she has her own dreams and doesn't want to sacrifice her ambitions just because Peter wants to leave music school. She bluntly tells him she doesn't want to marry him. Lieutenant Fuller urges Officer Nash to take the prank calls seriously, suspecting they may be connected to Cla's disappearance. He notices that fellatio is written down, which leads to laughter from another officer. Fuller scolds Nash for falling for Barb's prank, though Nash remains clueless about its significance. Meanwhile, Peter confronts Jess, trying to convince her not to have an abortion, but Jess firmly stands by her decision and asks him to leave. Phyllis, Lieutenant Fuller, and Officer Graham visit the house to discuss the phone calls with Jess. They plan to install a phone tap so they can listen in on the calls. Graham sets up the equipment while Fuller questions Jess about Cla's room. They assure the girls that a police officer will be stationed outside for their safety before leaving. Unbeknownst to them, Peter is spying on the house. Phyllis becomes emotional, fearing Claire is dead, and heads upstairs to rest. Jess sits by the fire, awaiting the next phone call. Upstairs, the mysterious man sneaks down from the attic and begins making unsettling noises. Jess, hearing the groans, goes upstairs and finds Barb having a nightmare. Jess helps Barb calm down with her inhaler, and Barb soon falls back to sleep. Later, as Jess is distracted by Carola's, the man enters Barb's room. He whispers, "Hey pretty Agnes, it's all right. It's me, Billy," before stabbing her with a glass unicorn multiple times. A woman instructs the Carolas to hurry the children to the car. Meanwhile, Jess receives another call, filled with disturbing sounds like moaning, a child crying for help, and Peter's words from an earlier conversation. After the call concludes, Fuller contacts Jess and informs her that they haven't been able to trace the caller. He advises her to keep the caller on the line for a longer duration if they call again. Fuller shares his suspicions about Peter, but before he can ask Jess additional questions, he is interrupted by an emergency at the station involving an old man who shot a police officer. Jess updates Phyllis about the situation and reassures her that Barb is doing fine since she recently checked on her. Phyllis responds by expressing her belief that Peter isn't the one responsible. Peter then calls, crying about not going through with the abortion. Fuller tells Officer Graham to trace the call, but Peter hangs up before they can do so. Jess admits to Fuller that she is pregnant, and Fuller asks if Peter was present when the strange calls came in. Jess realizes that Peter was indeed inside the house when she received one of the calls, meaning he could not be the caller. Later, in the kitchen, Phyllis screams when two men appear outside, claiming to be part of the search party. After asking if they've seen anything suspicious, they leave. Jess realizes that the only door still locked is the one leading outside. Fuller, seeking information on Peter, continues his investigation. Phyllis and Jess lock up the house and check on Barb. However, When Phyllis goes upstairs, the door suddenly slams shut behind her. Jess calls out for Phyllis but gets no response. As Jess answers the phone, the caller insults her and she hears a woman screaming, followed by someone calling the man Billy. Meanwhile, Graham tries to trace the call. Fuller is informed that the calls are coming from inside the house. He calls Officer Jennings, who is stationed outside, but finds that Jennings is dead. Fuller urgently tells Nash to contact Jess and keep her calm. Jess answers another phone call from Nash, who urgently tells her to leave the house without question. Jess, panicked, insists on finding her friends, but Nash warns her not to do so because the killer is inside. In a state of panic, Jess grabs a poker from the fireplace and heads upstairs. She finds Barb's room, only to discover both Barb and Phyllis dead. A voice from behind whispers, "Billy." Jess shoots at the front door but struggles to unlock it. Billy grabs her hair, but she manages to escape into the basement, locking the door behind her. As Billy attempts to break in, Jess searches the basement for a way out. Meanwhile, the police rush to the sorority house. Jess spots a shadow and becomes frightened, but it turns out to be Peter, who breaks a window and calls for Jess. Jess, terrified, believes Peter might be the killer since the calls came from inside the house earlier and he had been there. The police arrive just in time to hear Jess's screams. They find Peter's dead body on top of Jess, realizing that Jess had killed him in self-defense. Later, Jess is lying in bed, and the police assume Peter was the killer all along. Mr. Harrison faints upon hearing the news and is taken to the hospital. Jess is left alone in her room to rest, but the camera shifts to the attic, where the real killer, Billy, is heard humming. The film ends with the phone ringing once more, suggesting the terror is far from over. Thanks for watching.